And now I'm truly delighted to have three colleagues, college presidents, joining us for our next panel, Lifting as We Climb. It has truly not been an easy time to be a college president these days, so I am all the more appreciative that Dr. Espy, Dr. Johnson, and Dr. Wooten have carved some time out of their busy schedules to share their stories as leaders of their respective institutions with us this afternoon. I will introduce all three of them briefly, then I'll ask them a few questions, and I'll be looking in the Q&A box for questions from you, the audience. So you can pose your questions as you go along. So let me introduce first alphabetically Dr. Tracy Y. Espy. She became the 8th president and first African-American woman to lead Mitchell College in New London, Connecticut on July 1st, 2020. She's currently engaged with the Governor's Workforce Council, the FEMA Region 1 COVID-19 Long-Term Recovery Task Force, and the Connecticut Higher Education Resilience Working Group on Workforce Development. Before coming to Mitchell, Dr. Espy served as Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs at Pfeiffer University in North Carolina, overseeing all academic programs and divisions and working in various aspects of university administration. In April 2019, Dr. Espy received the National Zenobia L. Hikes Faculty Women of Color Award at Virginia Tech University. Dr. Espy holds a Ph.D. in Child, Family, Marriage, and Family Therapy from Syracuse University, a MS in Family Studies from Miami University of Ohio, and a BA from Berea College. Next, Dr. Robert E. Johnson was appointed the 6th president of Western New England University in August 2020. His 30-year career spans leadership roles at nonprofit colleges and universities in the Northeast and Midwest, including private, public, urban, rural, with enrollments from 2,000 to more than 25,000 students. Before joining Western New England University, he served as Chancellor of University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and as President of Becker College. Dr. Johnson is a member of the Council of Competitiveness. He serves on the Executive Committee and as Vice Chair of the Massachusetts Business Roundtable, the boards of MGH Institute of Health Professions, and the New England Council, among other volunteer engagements. Dr. Johnson holds a doctorate in higher education administration from Touro University International, a master's degree in education administration from the University of Cincinnati, a bachelor's degree in economics from Morehouse College, a certificate in applied neuroscience from MIT Sloan School of Management. And Dr. Lynn Wooten became the 9th president of Simmons University on July 1st, 2020. She is the first African-American to lead the university. Dr. Wooten is an active member of several national volunteer leadership organizations, including Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, Jack and Jill of America, Junior League, and the Lynx Inc. She is an advisory board member for the Aspen Institute Business and Society Program, and on the board of the Center for Effective Philanthropy and the University of Michigan Alumni Association. Dr. Wooten came to Simmons from Cornell University, where she was the David J. Nolan Dean and Professor of Management and Organizations at the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. Dr. Wooten also has a robust clinical practice providing leadership development, education, and training for a wide variety of companies and institutions. She is the author of nearly 30 journal articles in more than 15 book chapters, as well as managerial monographs and teaching cases. Welcome, Dr. Espy, Dr. Johnson, and Dr. Wooten. I guess for my opening question, and I'll ask you, I know that college presidents are not shy, so I'll ask you to jump in anytime, in any order. Reflecting back on the theme of this summit, which is shoulders on which we stand, I'll ask you to please give the audience a brief account of your individual journey to the presidency of your current institution. And as you do that, you might mention who are, were, or have been some of the important influences that inspired you or contributed to your journey in some fashion.
Well, I won't be shy. Oh, go ahead, Lynn.
I was going to let you go, but I grew up in Philadelphia, and if you like TV, you've probably been following Abbott Elementary. Abbott Elementary is the new hot show, and it talks about the struggles of an urban, under-resourced school district. And in some ways, that's the Philadelphia that I grew up in. But there were so many giants who I stood on their shoulders, but they also lift as they climb. First, I have to give, credit to my parents, but beyond my parents, it was those everyday leaders I saw, my elementary teachers, my high school teachers who saw something in me. I love college, and I graduated from high school in 1984 and have never left a college campus since then. So there have been lots of giants who have mentored me. I think about my dean at North Carolina A&T, who back in the 80s was buying SAT names to identify talented students who wanted to major in accounting. I think about people such as my dissertation advisor. But in my career, there have been lots of giants that I have stood on. And when I think about Black History Month that I like to honor, they've been mentors, they've been sponsors. I say I left home at 18, and I think about the communities that nurtured me, not only as a graduate student, but all through my career. There have been communities, especially communities of African-American people, who have really invested in my leadership, who have helped me live an integrative life. So it's not only my career, but it's my spiritual life and my personal development. And then, now being the president of Simmons, I want to give kudos to, for example, my board chair has been a shoulder. I've learned so much, and her having faith in me lead a university. And sometimes giants are also peers. I learn from my kids. I learn from my students. I learn, almost every day there's some giant shoulder that I'm standing on that I learn from.
Well, Lynn, so you're a hard act to follow, right? I grew up in Detroit, and the obvious, of course, my parents, uncles along the way, and I feel that I'm fortunate in so many ways. The very first job I had in higher education was at Central State University in Wilberforce, and the president there was Dr. Arthur E. Thomas, who was big advocate within the civil rights movement. And Lynn, he's from Philly. And I was, at the age of 24, he hired me. And I was the youngest. I was the executive director of admissions and enrollment management at the age of 24. And even though I didn't sit on the president's cabinet, he would allow me to sit in on the meetings. And after every meeting, or just about every meeting, he would spend about 15 or 20 minutes with me and explain to me why he made decisions the way he made them. Ultimately, I became his speechwriter, and from there, I started writing for other college presidents, politicians, corporate heads. So Dr. Thomas was the catalyst for me in higher ed. My parents, aunts and uncles for sure, but I've also had the good fortune of having people in my life up close and personal. When I was a student at Morehouse, there were two others along with myself in the economics program who worked with Dr. Willis Sheftal, who was working with Maynard Jackson and helped write the economic plan to make sure that African Americans got a certain percentage of government contracts. And then from there with Andy Young, I worked with him as well. I've had mentors like the late federal judge Damon Keith, who wrote the case to release the Nixon tapes in Watergate. Dr. Samuel Du Bois Cook, and the list just goes on and on. Dr. Dorothy Height, I sat at her feet for 15 years, and she guided me and counseled me. And then, of course, I would be remiss if not, mentioning my Uncle Bob, who was the executive editor and associate publisher of Jet Magazine for 43 years. And his guidance and wisdom, he was my second dad. He and I talked 2 or 3 days a week. I talk to my dad every day of the week. And so I've just been fortunate to have strong people. Dr. Gary Russey, who was president of Oakland University when I was his vice provost. He hired me at the age of 34. After 8 years, he walked into my office one day and said, "You got to go." And I said, "Where am I going?" I said, "Are you firing me?" He said, "No." He said, "You want to be a president? I can't make you a vice president. So you got to go find another job." So it was people like that who encouraged me to go on no matter what. And, I think Desmond Tutu put it best, if it appears as though our head rears above the crowd, it's simply because we're standing on the shoulders of those who came before us.
Great. Well, I'm not unlike Lynn and Dr. Johnson, but I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, right outside. And so when I think about the shoulders, I always think about sort of the ancestral, even though I wasn't maybe back in the day there, but the knowledge and history that comes from a family that started off as slaves, unlike similar to all of us in some way, some form or fashion. So I think about my parents and then just even my faith community when I was young. I think I learned very early on that, the power of relationships and the power of community and family, and being able to utilize those relationships as a way to help me grow. I remember even back as early as elementary school and people's, sort of saying, look, you have some form of talent, and sort of paving the way or parting the Red Sea, if you will. And so it really has been this incredible theme throughout my life. I always think back to, when you grow up in a place like Birmingham, Alabama, which is the, hotbed of the civil rights movement. Even though I wasn't born in that time, but it was after I grew up in the 70s and 80s that I learned so much about, caring for other people and service and equality. And even though I learned those things, but then having those kinds of things sort of displayed in my life through the relationships that I had, I think one of the most critical and important relationships that I had was with a cousin who had actually gone on to college. And I remember, I didn't know I can't remember when she went to college, but I remember I was probably in grade school and she was getting a master's. And honestly, I didn't even know what that was. I didn't know, what do you mean? And so just, having that relationship with her and that encouragement about further my education and seeing it right in front of my face that it could be done. And then later on, really understanding that, but even on into graduate school and then to my, doctoral dissertation, just the people that helped me, the people, I think about one person, my dissertation advisor, who said to me, listen, I know you want to get a job. You're not finished with your defending your dissertation yet. So if you want to go out and get a job without finishing your dissertation, I'm not even going to give you a letter of recommendation, because you must finish your dissertation before you go out there into the world. And, that was at the time, I thought that was a ridiculous idea, because when you're in graduate school for a long time, you're focused on finishing and getting a job. But looking back over my career, I really appreciate that, that commitment by Dr. Burgess to push me to finish and to move on with everything that I had, to leave Syracuse University with everything that I came there for. So there are so many people that I can think about who helped me along the way. And I'll say the last thing is, even when I was, long before I was a provost, and I got one of the first jobs I had in higher education, just those people that pulled me aside and talked to me about, look, it's a better way of going this direction. And even as I moved on and had a child, also those people whose shoulders I stand on, who taught me about the importance of family above work and having a balance in life. So not unlike my colleagues that have spoke before me, I stand on the shoulders of so many people that have gotten me to this point. So that's my story.
Thank you all for this, look back on how you get to where you are and some of the shoulders on which you stand today. So that's from looking back. I'm going to invite us to look forward. And I realize that, we're all so busy with dealing with our campuses and COVID and all of that, that there's not often a whole lot of time to think about the very distant future. But with that said, if you think of the contribution or the influence that you would like to leave, whether it is in your particular research field, whether it is at your own institution or whether it is for higher education in general? What would you say that it is?
I'll go ahead and share. One of the things I think about is, Mitchell College is this independent college here in Southeastern Connecticut. And one of the most incredible things about Mitchell is that we really focus on, educating a kaleidoscope of learners. So students that come from all walks of life with all kinds of learning and diversity. And I think when you come into this community, which I've been here since July of 2020, you learn a lot. And I think my colleagues would agree, you learn so much about your institution, and you see things that you want to change immediately and things that you want to make sure that carry on beyond your tenure here. And, even though obviously all of us want more students and more endowment, one of the things I think about for me, when you serve such a diverse community of learners, if I could leave anything, it would be making sure that our community sort of emulates this idea that Martin Luther King talked about, this sort of beloved community, but in a way where any student, regardless of their ability, can come here and get sort of an education, not just in the classroom, but outside of the classroom. And then that everyone has this, according to the MLK beloved community, this opportunity to receive respect and worth as an individual. So if that's anything that I would want to leave as a legacy, would be sort of a place where people, regardless of how they came here, what they came here with, but that they would have a sense of belonging, and that belonging would really, I guess the word I would say, embolden them to go out in the world and live lives as productive citizens. So that would be really something that's very important to me, outside of the other things that are important to a sustainable institution.
I think for me, it's a couple of things. My mother said to me a long time ago, your role in life is, you're destined to just, whatever you're doing, you just have to make a difference. And I think for me, that's what it's really all about, is making a difference and touching the lives of young people day in and day out. So, number one, I want my tombstone to read that if it can be said that I at least touch one person's life, that person may not be the next Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa, but they may very well be the one who inspires the next Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa, or discovers the cure to cancer. So that would be one. Number two, for our students, I believe that we all have a purpose. And part of my job is to help them to discover their why. And that on a planet with more than 7.7, 7.8 billion people, as an educated person, we all represent just over 7% of the world's population. So my students and your students have a social responsibility to go out and leave the world better than the way they found it. It's not a choice. We are all privileged. And so therefore, to whom much is given, much is received. And then the third thing is I want to mentor and coach at least 10 people to become college and university presidents. I'm 5 and running. I got 3 in the pipeline, and I got to find 2 more. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Wow, that's a story. So similar to Dr. Espy and Dr. Johnson, when you choose to be a college president, you really are about transforming lives. And you think about the United States, but most of the world. There is no other institution that helps what I call emerging adults from 18 to 28, that's undergrad and grad school, really think about their lives and put them on the path to be successful and have meaningful lives. And so what I want my first legacy to be is, and presidency lets you do this, doing this at scale, opening doors so people can get extraordinary college experiences and go out and use the world, use their strengths to serve the world. And that's what I've had the honor to do since I've entered the academy. Relating to my research and the other side of the presidency is that you spend the majority of your life at work. And what I have studied is how do you create thriving workplaces where people are excited about coming to work, where workplaces that are positively deviant, workplaces that are resilient, workplaces that are beloved communities. And I want my institution, Simmons, to be one of those outstanding places to work. I want it to be a place where faculty research is respected, and I want to do research on that. So I really care about the student experience in college as an institution where people come and learn how they can really use their strengths to serve the world. But I also feel called to make workplaces good.
I want now to link, a little bit of what you all just spoke about in terms of, workplaces. Dr. Wooten just talked about the lifting others that Dr. Johnson talked about, and the diversity of the workplace that Dr. Espy talked about, and talking a little bit about the theme of inclusive communities. If you go to any higher education conference these days, and in a lot of the conversations that we all take part of, some of which we are collectively part of, there is a lot of conversation about justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And all of our institutions are making efforts towards that, and all institutions aim to make some efforts towards that. And what would you say the reality is at your institution? I'll broaden this to say maybe in higher education in general, and sort of your assessment of where where we are and where we should be.
Okay. So at my institution, we have a ways to go. We're not where we need to be. In fact, we just literally launched an initiative earlier today with NIGHT, which is led by Dr. Sam Eustace out in California, UC San Diego, for our JEDI initiative. And it's probably going to be a 2 or 3 year long project where he's going to help our campus to understand where we are in terms of the baseline, help us to do some training, help us to put an infrastructure that is in place, that is sustainable and that's real. And Harry, you probably know me a little bit better than Dr. Wooten and Dr. Espy, but I call it like I see it. I think higher education is doing abysmal in the diversity space. I think that there are some institutions that are doing it really, really well, but I think for the most part, we're falling short. When you think about, if you take some basic data from a socioeconomic perspective, and you were to go back and look at higher college attainment rates going back 20, 30 years, the bottom 20% is still at 8%, which is what it was 30 years ago. Access is not there. People of color, we're not there. So we can talk the talk all we want as an industry, and I think we're getting better, and I think we are improving, and I think because it is a business imperative now, corporations and others are doing it, some out of necessity and some because they really believe it. I think about Bob Rivers at Eastern Bank and the great work that he's doing with diversity as a corporate leader. He's president there. So you have people like that that are embracing it. And you see it at certain institutions where leaders are doing it. But we as an industry, we still have a very, very, very long ways to go.
Okay, Lynn.
Yeah, Bob, I can see you call it like it is. And when you look at when all of us went to college, much hasn't changed. And that's really sad. Tracy, similar to what you said, Simmons was really founded on the principle of diversity. John Simmons made his money from making ready-made suits for men. He was the first person before all men's suits had to be tailored. And he realized that the women who were sewing his suits didn't have education. They were in this poverty trap. And he wanted to make sure they got out of the poverty trap by creating an all-women's college where women could be economically empowered. And we're about to be 125 years And we're asking ourselves the question of, okay, what does diversity look like now? The many phases of it: learning diversity, sexual orientation, gender diversity, social economics. And as a college president, first, we have to get in the room and we have to assess, like you said, you're doing, Bob. You got to understand who your audience is and what are the diversity pain points. And you have to be woke about it. And, every new college that I join, I have to understand what are the pain points. Then you have to say, okay, what are the bridges I need to build? Because you need to build bridges and cultivate capability to solve those problems. And is it academic advising I need? Is it a change in the culture? Is it the way the classroom experience? And that's what I'm doing. I'm asking those tough questions at Simmons about what we need to do so that everybody who comes into our community feels like they belong and feels like they can thrive. And it's hard. And I realized it takes a system approach. You got to work with corporations. You have to work with the K-12, because these problems, we didn't just start them when they get there, and we have to have outcomes. One of my key things at Simmons, what I have seen is that I want everyone to have what I'm calling experiential equity. Whoever, because what happens when some people go to colleges, as my mother would say, the rich get richer and everyone else just goes through college. So, you got a child who's going to do the study abroad and the great internship and go to every academic advising appointment and go to office hours. My mission is that every student should always have the best that Simmons has to offer. And that will create a place of belonging and inclusion.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dr. Wooten. So I do. Yeah, it's really interesting. When I remember thinking about this question, and I thought, here we go again. DEI is popular. And so, I could go on and on about that, but I won't because of time. But yeah, at my institution, we are talking about that. Coming here, let me just back up. Even in the presidential process, I'm sure my colleagues might have a similar experience. I don't know, but just learning about Mitchell and that is in Connecticut. And I remember the day I realized that it had, a third diversity. I didn't know what to think because I didn't readily see that in the initial materials and so forth. So I would say at present, we have made a conscious commitment to explore that, because diversity is so many layers and levels of it. And I think both of my colleagues have sort of mentioned that a little bit and how it plays out at their institutions. But I think for us, we have at least a deliberate and intentional, I guess I should say having a deliberate and intentional conversation about it, creating goals, objectives, and outcomes. And, but I'm a firm believer in that we're just honestly scratching the surface, because it's only as good as you can talk to the various different people and understand the true nature of DEI as it relates to so many things. And I love what Dr. Wooten, you say your mother often says, those who rich get richer than everybody else, whatever happens. And I see so much of the challenges in terms of socioeconomic class and how institutions, how do we handle that as it relates to DEI? So my assessment here at Mitchell College is that we're moving forward with a clear focus, and that we're really committed to having those tough conversations, making those tough decisions to create a more equitable and I should say belonging rich community. And that's what's important here going forward. But it's not an easy, I don't think it's an easy thing to do, especially as a new president coming in. And I'm sure, I would imagine the question I would ask both Dr. Johnson and Dr. Wooten, it's not easy coming into your institution and beginning to sort of peel back the layers of things that have probably existed in the institution for many, many years. Am I correct about that?
You are correct, and I'll even take it a step further, the elephant in the room. As African-American presidents at predominantly white institutions, there's another layer there in terms of even how you have those conversations. I mean, that's our reality. Doesn't make it right or wrong, it just is.
You're so right, because every day we show up and we're Black. It's part of our story, it's part of who we are, it's part of how we lead. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, we're constantly thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
thoughtful and great answers. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the Q&A box now. This is from a member of the audience. Each of you amazing presidents has mentioned having several meaningful mentors. What advice do you have for students to make links with potential mentors, and how to reflect on what mentors they may already have? So you mentioned the great mentoring that you've received. What advice for students on both looking for mentors as well as taking advantage of the mentors and the relationships that they currently have?
I would say, I think the first thing is to look, right? And sometimes it's as simple as someone that you have a class with, or it could be an advisor. I would just say looks. You know, sometimes I think I'll call it the olden days, we might have looked at someone that resembles us. So think about, in some cases, I'll tell you what I look for: someone's values, someone that had high integrity, if I could learn about that. But I think the first thing, honestly, students, is to seek someone out, ask questions, sort of explore. And even if you don't necessarily have anyone in mind, you might be able to ask other people or learn about people that are in your departments. And a lot of times, some of the greatest mentors are people that are in the community, that are out in your faith-based area. But I say the first thing is to look, ask questions, and continue to have those conversations until you find something that you believe is going to be helpful to you.
So I'm a true believer that your mentors should be your personal board of directors, and that you need a constellation of mentors. And when I'm coaching people, I almost have a checklist of different categories, Harry. So you definitely need your true mentor. And Carla Harris, who's a partner at Morgan Stanley, says, your mentor is someone who gives you advice and who loves the good and the bad in you. You can tell your mentor everything, but you need a sponsor too on your personal board of directors. When you're not in the room, that they're going to put their fist on the table and they're going to get you that next job. And so your sponsor only needs to see you're good. And then sometimes we all need coaches. We have one problem and we need someone to help us through that problem, like a coach. Even Tiger Woods at his greatness always had coaches. And so I study this topic, so you can see I have a lot to say about it. And then Malcolm Gladwell talks about you need maven and connectors in your personal board of directors. So a connector is that person who knows everybody in town. Like I know Bob knows everybody in the Boston area. So when I need to find something, I'm going to call Bob and ask him where to go. But you also need, so that's the connector. The maven are the people who just acquire knowledge. I grew up with a maven, a giant. She knew everything. She knew how to catch the train in Philly. She knew who the New York Times, she knew on sale. And then like you said, Tracy, you need people inside your profession for mentors and outside your profession. And you need people who live in your community. I have coached so many young women professionals, and they don't know how to file childcare or something. I was like, well, who do you know in your community? Who do you know? So you need people in your community too, and you need people in your institution and outside your institution. So I am a firm believer in the person who asked this question, the personal board of directors metaphor for mentors.
I would simply say amen to what both Lynn and Tracy have said. And I would also say, seek out people who are not like you. Sure, I'm Black, but there have been people from every color of the rainbow who have helped me and mentored me, and coached me, and don't be shy about seeking out a mentor. If there's a certain thing you aspire to do, find somebody who's doing that and seek them out to be your mentor. I've had people call me up out of the clear blue and said, I was reading about you or what have you, can we have a conversation? I will talk to anyone. So you'll be surprised how people who are sitting in seats that you think are powerful. I don't think my seat's that powerful, maybe when Tracy do, but who will be more than willing to talk to and listen. So reach out.
Another question from the audience is going back to our, your personal stories, and this is from a fellow president, the President DeSalvo from Endicott. Was there a moment or experience when you realized that you wanted to be or could be a college president?
For me, yes. When Dr. Thomas used to bring me into his office after the cabinet meetings, he kept saying, you should become a college president. And for the longest, I said, no, I have no interest in working, in academia. In fact, he recruited me to work with him, so that I could get my master's for free. And in my head, I would work for him for 2 or 3 years and then go off and do what I wanted to do. And 10 years later, it was 10 years later before I left there. But I was sitting in his office one day, and he and President George Herbert Walker Bush were really good friends. And we had given him an honorary degree. And for those of you who are old enough, he is the one who appointed Clarence Thomas to go on to the Supreme Court. And President Bush had asked Dr. Thomas to write a letter of recommendation. And, at that time, I'm his writer along with the director of PR, and we're arguing with him up and down. Dr. Thomas, you can't do this. And he just went on and on and on and on and on. And finally, he paused and he said, look, what you will learn, he said, anybody can be your friend when everything is going right. But the true test of friendship is who's standing with you when everything is going wrong. My friend, the President of the United States, has asked me to write this letter. I'm going to write this letter. And he said, remember something. If you ever end up in a position of leadership, leading an organization and a university, and he looked at me, said, yeah, you, Bob, remember, you don't have a permanent political party. You only have permanent political interests. We wrote the letter for Dr. Thomas. 2 or 3 years later, we got 20 or 30 million from USAID, funding to build a building for the first manufacturing engineering program in the country. And as the leader, and so sitting there in that meeting, I had this epiphany. And it was at that moment I said, you know what? I want to do this. That was my moment.
Sometimes you learn vicarious from others, people who just touch your life briefly. And University of Michigan has a large King Day event, similar to what you're hosting here, Harry. And one year we had Janetta Cole come speak, who is the former president of Spelman and Bennett. And all of the Black presidents, we all know she's dynamic, she's charismatic. And I was like, I want to be like Janetta one day. I want to, and this was, 15 years ago. I think I would like to lead a women's college. And I had told the dean at the time that I wanted to meet Janetta. He put me at the luncheon table with her. So that was my one moment, living vicariously, reading about Janetta's journey, experiencing her as a college president. And then I mentioned that to actually the search firm. I mentioned that to a partner in the search firm earlier in my career, and he remembered that. And when the Simmons job came up, he nominated me for it. So putting things out in the universe sometimes make a difference too.
I love that Janetta B. Cole story. I think for me, I knew I wanted to make a difference somehow in academia. And it was really, similar to what my colleagues have said. It was someone helping me to think about that. And I remember when I realized that being in academic administration, which is, I started that at Syracuse, the ability to change people's lives at a different level. And so I knew that was something that I didn't know how. I wasn't even thinking about being a dean, to be honest. And I think it was just those little experiences. And I think, to be frankly honest, Janetta B. Cole actually came to my college, Syracuse, to speak. And I don't even think at that time I thought about being a college president. I think the more that I got involved with the work that I was doing and seeing the importance of what leadership meant to that, and someone saying, you may want to think about that one day. And that really started the course for me. And then having those experiences, like I did not a course, but an experience. Oh, that's where I met Harry first through the CIC about this idea of mission and connection to the presidency. And that was really like, okay, all right. But I didn't know how or when. So I think we all sort of found those little pathways to get there. But I think at the highest level, we're all focused on serving others and doing the best that we can with our lives. And if the presidency provides that for us, I think we've all been in for that. So, yeah.
Great responses once again. We had the 5 minutes alert 3 minutes ago, but there's a question from a faculty member that I think we should just give a quick answer to that if we can. And how do you transition from a faculty position to an administrative position when you don't have administrative experience?
That's a great question. And something Tracy said is, people will start to identify you. You can start with department chair, research center. I also think about looking at training programs. You both said you did the CIC. I did the Big Ten leadership training program. And so finding training programs, finding mentors and raising your hand. You are a faculty member. I know you're busy with your research and teaching, but chair a committee, volunteer to do something for Harry, raise your hand sometimes.
I love that. It's just do what you can where you are, right? So if all you can do is plan a student event or something in your department, honors thing. I mean, honestly, I guess I would say exercise or flex that muscle or begin that little process, even though in your mind it might be micro. To be frankly honest, I was doing little things. I don't even want to call it, I shouldn't like categorize if they're big or small, but I just was doing the things that were important to do it in the front of me at that time. And I just say, start with where you are and do the very, very best you can, and then step out and be willing to volunteer when others may want nothing to do with that task. I mean, you'll ultimately get there if that's something that's really in your heart and in your mind that you want to do.
I'll simply, in the interest of time, I'll simply say ditto.
Thank you. I think we could, continue the conversation. There are more questions in the Q&A box, but before I turn things over to Dr. Schock, let me once again thank my colleagues, Dr. Tracy Espy, Dr. Robert Johnson, and Dr. Lynn Wooten for being with us this afternoon, sharing their stories, their insight, and their passion for their institutions, for higher education in general, and for making all of our institutions more just, inclusive communities. Thank you.
Yes, I want to echo that. Thank you so much. It was really an inspiring conversation, and I learned a lot from each of you, and your passion is evident. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us. We will be taking a short break before our closing keynote speaker. So please enjoy your break, and we will see you soon. Welcome back to the Black Experience Summit. I'm so excited. I've been looking forward to this all day to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Dr. Treva B. Lindsey. Dr. Lindsey is Associate Professor at The Ohio State University and the co-founder of Black Feminist Night School at Zora's House. Her research and teaching interests include African American women's history, Black popular and expressive culture, Black feminisms, hip hop studies, critical race and gender theory, and sexual politics. Her new book, America Goddamn: Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice, will be released this April. Her first book, Colored No More: Reinventing Black Womanhood in Washington, D.C., was a Choice 2017 Outstanding Academic Title. She has published in the Journal of Pan-African Studies, Souls, African and Black Diaspora, the Journal of African American Studies, African American Review, the Journal of African American History, Meridians, Transnationalism, Urban Education, The Black Scholar, Feminist Studies, and Signs. She was a 2021 ACLS Mellon Scholars and Society Fellow. She was also the inaugural Equity for Women and Girls of Color Fellow at Harvard University from 2016 to 2017. She writes for and contributes to outlets such as Time, CNN, Al Jazeera, NBC, BET, Complex, Fox, to just name a few. It is a joy for me to welcome Treva Lindsey here today. Her talk is entitled Witness and Witnessing: The Archive of Black Freedom Struggles. Welcome, Treva.
Thank you so much for having me today. It has been a pleasure being a participant and a listener for a good portion of the summit. It's been a really inspiring moment to take in so much. The president's panel that just happened, the panel before that, I was just jotting down notes and I think making last minute adjustments even to my keynote in reference to that, to really engage some of these important conversations that have been brought to the fore. First and foremost, I want to thank the planning committee and everyone involved with making this happen. And thank you, Elms College, for having this kind of summit. It means a lot to know that this kind of work is happening at institutions and that this kind of energy and investment is happening as well. I'm so heartened to see so many participants here as well and look forward to the Q&A and the opportunity to converse with you after. And thinking about this moment, it's just been, as I mentioned earlier, since it was such a pleasure to hear from folks and thinking about my own talk, it was specifically around this idea of telling our stories and the power that resides in storytelling. One of the earlier speakers said, I think I jotted it down correctly, acknowledgement is indeed one of the most powerful forces in the universe. And what it means as a historian to witness, to do the act of witnessing. And in my new book, I talk about this concept of withnessing, what it means to be part of this history, this inheritor of history, and also being a part of the ways that those histories impact our lives today and will continue to impact the futures that we hope to have or will not have should we not do that incredible work that needs to be done. Our stories of joy, our stories of resistance, our stories of imagination and creativity and genius can fortify our struggles. And more importantly, they're still being written. That part of what is so intriguing about a summit like this is it offers us an opportunity to look back as a way to push into new futures, to imagine new futures, to envision new futures. So it is at once for me always a celebration both of Black History Month, but also one of Black futures and what becomes possible when we imagine a future. And so truth telling and sharing is such an important part of that work. Our current moment, we are witnessing and bearing witness, many of us, in this educational setting, to a very coordinated and deeply troubling refusal, right? This refusal of telling hard histories, the privileging of the discomfort of having to grapple and wrestle with these hard histories, and a deliberate, what I like to call selective amnesia around the history of this nation, the history of injustices, both here and throughout the world. That there is a concerted effort to push back against learning about the joys and pains and resistance and the more inglorious parts of our histories, fearing that that will create division, right? Or fearing that those histories might empower those who've been minoritized, marginalized, dispossessed, disenfranchised. And it's such a crucial moment because we are understanding how powerful knowledge and information is to push back against this, to push back against the call to not bear witness to our past. And more importantly in this moment, to bear witness with our past in ways that construct new possibilities for our future. There's a war of information and misinformation playing out at our schools at multiple levels, but particularly thinking about our K through 12 level, which makes this work of uncovering and telling hard truths particularly timely, if not urgent. What are we hiding from? What does it mean to hide from hard histories? What is at stake when the difficult dialogues that needed to be had about race, gender, class, sexuality, disability, colonialism, imperialism, indigenous genocide and forced removal, what is at stake when we don't tell those histories? Who are we not including in our visions of democracy? How can we actually celebrate and affirm the presence of democracy if we're not bearing witness to those hard truths as well and working to make new truths possible, to actualize a democratic vision that has still not been actualized in this country and in very few places throughout the world as it pertains to inequity and injustice. I'm thinking about this in relationship to 2020 and seeing this as a post-2020 moment. Obviously, we have been in a global pandemic for the better part almost of 2 years at this point. But also what happened in 2020 to demarcate this was a global uprising in response primarily to the killing of George Floyd, as well as the killings of Breonna Taylor, the witnessing we did with the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, and so many other names included in that. There seemed to be a swell of energy that was taking to the streets. I felt the energy outside of my window. I was stuck inside in Mass. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm right by the State House. And so marches for weeks were happening in my community, and people pushing back and asking questions about, is this who we are as a nation? And people throughout the world looking towards the US and asking some really difficult questions, which asked us to reckon with our histories of race and racism in this country. There was a collective energy that amassed around racial justice. And unsurprisingly, some of that energy, a considerable amount of that energy, has seemingly burned out. That passion that we were seeing when we're seeing multiple books written by Black authors talking about race, talking about those hard histories and having those difficult dialogues that were once on the New York Times bestseller list. Those books may have ended up in people's homes, but I'm not sure they ended up in people's heads and hearts with regards to this. That the actual act of witnessing was not happening in the ways that forward substantive change and sustained change that is being demanded. We are still talking, we are still having conversations like the ones we're having today, but the resistance to having these kinds of conversations, the resistance to talking about what led people to participate in freedom struggles across different eras, that resistance to that kind of art history has garnered even more traction in 2021 and 2022. It is in this moment that I insist, as it has been insisted today, that we revisit the shoulders on which we stand. I saw this theme for the summit and was heartened that there was this emphasis on the past, not only because I'm a historian by training, but thinking about the heart practice of doing this kind of work, the ethical practice of doing this kind of work that demands that we look back. The demand that we look back, the demand that we embrace, the demand that we learn more, that we engage more, that we be unafraid, that we be courageous and brave in looking to the past in ways that help us to direct our future. We look for ways in doing this and search for clarity and search of and moving with fortitude with how we can mobilize and also resist. And thinking about this, this means these issues are multifold, multidimensional, and complex. But it is with this fortitude and with this clarity and with this willingness to witness that these freedom struggles propel. So whether we're talking about what is happening in our schools, our collective reaction to COVID, the fight for a living wage, healthcare, mass targeted incarceration, voting rights, all of these are part of these larger conversations of looking towards our history in an effort to move forward in more robust, dynamic, and involved and engaged ways. There are so many histories that would be useful for us as inspiration and for imagination. I talk a lot about imagination in this conversation because imagination isn't simply what we dream up, but it's the work we're willing to do, which means we have to be unbound by this moment. We have to be unbound by our current condition to imagine what is beyond this. We have to be able to see beyond what is possible in this moment to reach out for new possibilities and future moments. And so I'm leaning on both the imagination of our ancestors, our foremothers, our foreparents, our forefathers, to think about this and imagine the things they imagined, which is a source of inspiration in moving forward here. It is a powerful weapon against injustice. And so often our imaginations are even limited by the conditions under which we currently reside. But if we allow that to be a limitation, we will continue to repeat errors and not move forward the legacy that is so deeply ingrained in Black freedom struggles. I want to take us first to 1442 in terms of thinking about this, which seems like a very, very, very long time ago, 580 years to be specific in terms of doing this, an alternate kind of origin story at a global scale. And 1442 demarcates a very important moment in the world as we think about what would become the slave trade and what would become the racial global order that we see around slavery and the attempts to inferiorize Black people, peoples of African descent throughout the world. This is an important moment to think back when we think about how freedom struggles began and the daily kinds of struggles that don't get the kind of documentation that we would have in an archive of those who were already resisting this new social order, this new racial order, the condition of servitude that they were made to be put under. In 1513, we actually have the first arrival of Africans to what we can now consider the United States in modern day Puerto Rico. So even 100 years before the 1619 date that we have come to know and has caused incredible controversy among many in telling our story and telling these hard histories, we have enslaved people who are here and again ingraining in this racial order and people who are resisting in this moment as well. And 1526 is when we actually arrive in present day South Carolina, that you see the presence of enslaved people. So really, even in this country, we're talking about a 500+ year history of enslavement, of dehumanizing, which also means we're talking about a 500-year history of resistance and freedom struggle, and people who witness the conditions of inequity and injustice and who push forward in spite of. And the point of this talk for many today is both the insurgent possibilities of fighting and resisting in spite of. So over 580 years, we see this struggles against a rationale of Black people being inferior and valued solely for their productive and reproductive labor. And we see the legacies of that in various inequities and injustices that exist into this day. Saidiya Hartman identifies them as the afterlife of slavery, what we witness in terms of disparate impact of COVID, disparate impact of policing, disparate impact of criminalization, disparate impact and outcomes for education, that these are ongoing afterlives of a condition of servitude, of the conditions of unfreedom that were here. And it is also the resistance that has been ongoing. It is not waves of resistance. In fact, it is a continuous, robust field of resistance that we're seeing for people who are experiencing firsthand, who are witnessing the conditions of unfreedom, and those allies and accomplices who are witnessing alongside, who know that the condition of unfreedom is unjust. And so even under the most dire of conditions, there was Black resistance. And what I and many other scholars, activists, organizers, elders refer to as insurgency. I will spend most of the rest of my time today focusing on a few key examples of this tradition, of those whose shoulders on which we stand, and particularly that of Black women, and an effort both to kind of highlight those we may not think about and kind of untold histories, even about those figures we think we know or have some semblance of an understanding of. I want us to be reminded of the call from freedom fighter Assata Shakur as I move through this, that it is our duty to fight for freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and protect one another, and we have nothing to lose but our chains. It is this kind of energy and this kind of fortitude and clarity that I stand with and sit with as I move through this. Negro women may be dangerous. These words accompanied the image of Harriet Tubman on a wanted poster from the 1850s. A freedom fighter, military strategist, and armed resistor, Tubman was an enemy of the state. She was a terrorist by some definitions and figurations, whose every liberatory act posed a distinct threat to US chattel slavery and the robust economy of anti-Blackness. Tubman evaded capture and continued her freedom work until emancipation. Post-emancipation, she remained committed to social justice. Tubman planned, embarked on, and successfully executed numerous journeys back to the trenches of the slaveholding South to guide and lead fugitive Black people to freedom. On numerous occasions, she put her own life on the line for the freedom of others. It is therefore unsurprising that a radical Black feminist collective in the 1970s would name themselves after one of Tubman's most harrowing liberatory acts, the raid at Combahee River. This military operation led to the freeing of over 750 enslaved people in the South Carolina Lowcountry. Tubman's courage, knowledge of the area, and effective tactics for evading capture were tremendous assets for the Union Army. Whereas her work on the Underground Railroad required anonymity, secrecy, and strategic stealth in the face of grave danger. The raid at Combahee River was one of Tubman's more public, spectacular, and highly visible acts of resistance. Her more covert work, however, established her as a powerful force in the war to end slavery. Over 100 years after one of the most successful domestic military operations in US history, the founding members of the Combahee River Collective chose a name that inextricably linked them to a history of Black women's radical activism. In the Combahee River Collective statement, primary authors Demita Frazier, Beverly Smith, and Barbara Smith began the document with powerful statements about the origins of contemporary Black women's activism. They stated that we find our origins in the historical reality of Afro-American women's continuous life and death struggle for survival and liberation. Frazier, Smith, and Smith named Tubman as one of the thousands of Black women activists whose work connected to being part of two oppressed groups, both the racial oppression and gender oppression. The statement, and more importantly, the Combahee River Collective, unapologetically conjoined themselves to generations of Black freedom fighters. In naming their collective after Tubman, these Black women activists illuminated the significance of Tubman beyond mythology or even hagiography. They identified Tubman as a historical exemplar of personal sacrifice and militancy, which are key elements of both witnessing and for the struggle of justice. The collective pinpointed militancy as a key thread in the genealogy of Black activism, as well as its cost. This genealogy encompasses the rebellious and revolutionary acts of Black people in the United States against the practices and historically contingent technologies of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. The combination of personal sacrifice and militancy and Black political activism is insurgency, is imagination, is active witnessing. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, insurgent has emerged as a politicized and even pejorative term, often used interchangeably with terrorist. Although not explicitly racialized, the term insurgent conjures the image of a person of Middle Eastern descent who allegedly commits a violent mass attack. It is rarely used to describe other forms of mass murder occurring in the United States or significant mass harm that's done to different communities, and specifically attacks against communities of color. In the current moment, insurgent also implicitly can signal an anti-Americanness, an anti-US-ness. Within the logics of Americanness versus anti-Americanness, insurgents pose grave danger to the US democratic ideals, the American way of life, and to the security of the nation. Consequently, for those invested in Americanness and even in US exceptionalism, insurgents must be neutralized by any and all means necessary. And this includes insurgent knowledge. This includes knowledge in uncovering those histories that are difficult and hard and don't render us as perfect or equitable or just, but those that point towards the flaws, the failures, the imbalances, the disparities. Those are insurgent knowledges that inspire people to resist, that inspire people to understand anew. Insurgency has been and is a Black political activist standpoint, within the genealogy and the broader genealogy of Black people's political and radical activism. This activism peaks in terms of visibility in particular moments of heightened anti-Black, imperialistic or capitalistic violence and subjection. So what we saw, in fact, in 2020, when we think about the uprisings that occurred in the wake of the aforementioned killings, that you see these more spectacular moments of grief, of mourning, of loss, of collective witnessing. But that is always occurring because these injustices are fairly ubiquitous and ongoing, mundane and quotidian. Danger has been and will continue to be ubiquitous until that struggle for justice is resolved. But Black political activism provides a distinct space for Black people to reckon with systems of oppression. This tradition of reckoning informs how we continue to organize and mobilize in the 21st century. It is on these shoulders that we stand. Black women freedom fighters, for example, of the 21st century consistently engaged tactics rooted in personal sacrifice and militancy. Contemporary activism, which is often loosely defined in this era as the movement for Black Lives Matter era or the Black Lives Matter era activism, builds on a genealogy of this framing that I started this with. Negro women may be dangerous, Negro people may be dangerous, Negro men may be dangerous. Indebted to Black women and activists and folks like the Combahee River Collective, organizers in the 21st century and in this Black Lives Matter era carry the torch of Black insurgency. They also inhabit the liberatory struggles of enslaved people who poisoned their slave owners or who set fire to plantations, freed women in sewing circles who organized to free enslaved people, Black people plotting to free political prisoners, as well as Black people arming themselves in defense of their homes and communities. There is a multitude of ways that resistance has been shown and that we've seen freedom struggles emerged. The most spectacular are often the ones that get remembered and put into history books. But I interrogate and want us to think about the freedom struggles of everydayness as well. That people engage under unique understanding that there are many fronts on which this battle must be fought. Insurgency captures the urgency, tenacity, creativity, resiliency, and potency of Black people's radical quotidien and mid to large scale activism. It rescues our sister Rosa Parks from her status as the symbolic mother of the civil rights movement, solely remembered for her role in a distinct moment of historical significance, but reminding us of her role as an anti-rape activist and a seasoned and lifelong crusader for justice. So when thinking about Rosa Parks, not holding her in this singular spectacular moment, but actually understanding the history that leads her to this moment, the incredible history of her researching and investigating the rapes of Black women in the Deep South, women like Recy Taylor, who was raped, he was gang raped by a group of white men in Abbeville, Alabama. It is Rosa Parks who investigates her and ensures that this story becomes a national story so that people are understanding the depths of what's happening in Alabama at the time. It's recasting the Montgomery bus boycott, not only as a singularly important event in civil rights history, but also understanding it as a push for Black women to control what is happening to their bodies. As it's not just about being able to sit at the front of the bus, it's about not being assaulted on the bus. It's not about not being attacked on the bus or being derided or being treated unjustly on the bus. And it is because of her roots as an anti-rape activist, someone who cares about the bodies and lives and experiences of Black women, that she is someone who is seen as an important figure and someone who can be arrested for this and become this symbol of the movement. But reducing her to a symbol reduces the legacy. She was bearing witness in the 1940s before she is witnessing as a participant and a figure in the Montgomery bus boycott. This approach of insurgency scoffs at recent attempts to erase a larger history of opposition to Shirley Chisholm during her presidential campaign. There's this selective amnesia that there was this collective radical energy that went to support Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to run for the nomination for a major party in the United States. She did not receive a considerable amount of support from individuals. So it's remembering that and celebrating her as unbossed and unbought, but it is also remembering the kind of sexism that she encountered, the hesitancy that people had. And it is also the erasure of the many women who ran for president before her, many of whom are in even more radical parties, the Communist Party, the Workers' Party, the Progressive Party, that there is a nearly 80-year history of Black women seeking office in the United States and not being able to understand what it means to bear witness to that kind of history, that erasure of that kind of history. This approach to insurgency and witnessing also recuperates Tubman as an enemy of the state. And not just any state, a simply unjust state, and not as a flattened or comfortable American hero who now we're excited to put on a $20 bill, that she is someone who was labeled dangerous, who was inimical to the project of slavery, who was inimical to the current tide of what the United States represented. Identifying these Black women radical activists as insurgents provides an expansive way for engaging how Black women and Black people more broadly mobilize and organize, both formally and currently. Now offer a few close readings of these daily things through the spectacular moments as of late of people who bore witness to injustice and acted in response to that. Moments that are spectacularized and often vilified within mass media often involve Black women disrupting, disorienting, decrying, and demanding. Those railing against contemporary Black women insurgents deploy sanitized and ahistorical images of and narratives about historical figures such as Tubman and Parks and of unnamed civil rights era protesters to argue for the value of the less provocative and disruptive and less imaginative forms of protests. Tubman and Parks' militancy and the violence Black women protesters encountered in past Black freedom struggles, from plantations to the streets of Selma, Alabama, do a disservice to how we tell history. They do a disservice to the project of witnessing. You write these women into an ahistoric and thinly politicized recollection of African-American activism. It is Tubman's lantern and not her rifle that is celebrated and commemorated via doodles on Google or postal stamps, or perhaps the $20 bill at some point. Black women in the 21st century operate from and build on a more precise history of this insurgent activism, that you cannot reduce Tubman's legacy to either her lantern or her gun, but it encompasses a multitude of strategies, tools, and sacrifices, and is moved by the project of witnessing and witnessing. Contemporarily and historically, Black women use their visibility, their bodies, and strategizing to fight against racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, and various forms of oppression. They embody the spirit of Combahee through that understanding of the very definite revolutionary task of performing and witnessing. This task requires a number of approaches, some of them more direct and visceral to these systems of oppression. Bree Newsome, the Black woman activist who scaled a flagpole to remove the Confederate flag at the State House of South Carolina after the anti-Black terrorist attack on Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. This insurgent act both literally and figuratively challenged white supremacy. The action, collectively planned by 10 people, including Newsome, occurred just 10 days after Dylann Roof brutally murdered 9 people at Mother Emanuel. Images of the removal of such a powerful symbol from a seat of state power and authority flooded social and mainstream media. Footage from this courageous act of civil disobedience captured Newsome reciting the Lord's Prayer as she removed the flag and descended down the pole. Police officers awaited Newsome and one of her co-conspirators, James Ian Tyson, at the bottom of the flagpole. They immediately arrested both activists for daring to discard one of the most explicit symbols of US white supremacy and former histories of the US Confederacy. It is worth noting that in the immediate aftermath of the Charleston white supremacist terrorist attack, sales of Confederate flags skyrocketed. Reflecting upon her insurgent act a year later, Newsom stated in an interview with Melissa Harris Perry, "I knew it would not be permanent, but this was an important act of civil disobedience. That flag has not been flying continuously since the Civil War. The state of South Carolina raised it in 1961 as a specific statement of opposition to the civil rights movement and a symbol against Black people gaining equality. I had a strong feelings about that flag for a long time, but last summer it became intolerable." Newsom framed her actions of civil disobedience were so important. Her witnessing of that flag and her decision that she no longer wanted to see this symbolic force represented at the seat of state power encouraged her civil disobedience. Newsom expected to be arrested, but it did not lessen and does not lessen the significance of her risking her body and her livelihood for striking back against this form of violence and this form of symbolism. She and her co-conspirators prepared for a range of responses for the removal of the flag, but the preparation could not protect them from the array of possible consequences they would face when challenged with state authority. The images of Newsom removing the Confederate flag conveyed defiance and conviction. The act, as well as the circulation of the video and the images of Newsom scaling the flagpole at the State House in Charleston, South Carolina, reignited an important conversation about the terror represented by the flag, particularly the flag's presence at the State House. Ultimately, this heated and polarizing debate led to the permanent removal of the Confederate flag from the State House. A symbol that invoked chattel slavery, anti-Black racial terror, and racial segregation no longer had a state-sponsored home in the state in which Tubman had led a raid against the Confederacy over 100 years prior. Acts like this are also mirrored in different moments with collective youth organizing that has a longer tradition of witnessing, youth feeling compelled and urged to rail against forms of injustice. And one of the ways that that often happens is the usage of the bodies as a site of insurgent protest. Organizations like Assata's Daughter, based in Chicago, build upon this legacy of Black women's bodies being sites of insurgent activism. Named after freedom fighter Assata Shakur, the Chicago-based organization cultivates and supports a newer generation and younger generation of Black women activists organizing for transformative justice. Their tactics are often intentionally disruptive, highly visible, and creatively spectacular in their deployment. They attempt to embody, as they call it, unapologetic Blackness in practice, and are determined to bear witness with their bodies to systems of inequity. Defining themselves as a grassroots intergenerational collective of radical Black women, Assata's Doors firmly locates themselves within the movement for Black lives. Recognizing a connection between the defunding of public institutions and an increasing militarization of law enforcement, especially in the lives of Black communities, on April 30th, 2016, Assata's Daughters, Fearless Leading by Youth, also known as FLY, and Black Lives Matter Chicago, shut down Lakeshore Drive in Chicago and caused notable disruption for NFL Draft Town Saturday, demanding permanent funding for Chicago State University and the firing of Chicago police detective Dante Severin for the 2012 killing of Rukia Boyd. Protesters chain-linked themselves together and obstructed traffic until police forcibly removed their chains and detained the protesters. The protest strove to disrupt NFL Draft Town and to call attention to police murders of Black women and the dire effects of defunding a public institution of higher learning serving primarily marginalized communities. The image of young Black women in all Black with red berets chained together, chanting and obstructing traffic, circulated across various social media platforms. They proposed that money used to fund the police be redirected towards saving Chicago State University. They connected the divestment in public education to state investment in over-policing and brutalizing marginalized communities. These young Black women and femmes mobilized around interconnected forms of oppression and marginalization. They also shed light upon a longer history of the ways in which Black communities are often defunded. Resources within those communities are often defunded, and saw their bodies as a primary way of grabbing the attention of these individuals who had the power to change this. Both of these examples of Black women's insurgent activism pivot around singular, spectacular acts in a contemporary context. These acts, alongside the unseen and quotidian work of Black women and girls and Black people more broadly, surviving, living, and thriving, as well as fighting against systems of oppression, is a form of both witnessing and witnessing. It is a form of righteous and indignant struggle. Black women's radical activism relies upon insurgency as a mobilizing force. It demands sacrifice and militancy through its disruption of the status quo. It reaches back and imagines other possibilities. It looks to the future while understanding that knowing the past is a key to unlocking new futures. There are insurgent possibilities in the range of ways that people are organizing today, especially those who are deeply informed by movements of the past, by freedom struggles of the past, by understanding on whose shoulders on which we stand. The most visible and moments of resistance and defiance, however, always warrant our consideration as those who are looking at the struggle and trying to find ways to be involved, to be engaged. In a historical moment in which social and digital media function as viable, though imperfect, tools for mobilizing and organizing, these insurgent acts effectively and effectively embody this insurgent tradition of remembering and witnessing. We have an opportunity to share witnessing, to collectively witness, to make sure that our witnessing of injustice is broadly done. Not just in the United States, but without border, without concern for status, that there is a possibility for a more robust form of witnessing that is a joining in, an invitation in to these struggles. It is the labor of Black activists, from Tubman to more recent activists, to those who are organizing right now in this moment, to people who are attending this summit, who have been invested in Black freedom struggles, to continue to provide roadmaps and glimpses of justice and freedom. Activists who engage in insurgent imagining, because the realities of what is required means that we need unbought and unbossed and unbound liberatory practices. Insurgency for some may resound as an unwarranted or even violent force against the state or against our common unconventional ideals. But this framing disavows the violence that is enacted by systems of oppression on the bodies and lives of Black people. It is important to think about insurgency and radical rememberings and radical witnessing as a way to resist disenfranchisement, marginalization, dispossession, and devaluation, and to thinking about how we undo harm, how we transform into peaceful places, into engagements with one another. Each generation of Black freedom fighters and insurgents traverse paths to full abolition from systems of unfreedom. And the idea of this in this moment means that history is being made every day by those who refuse, by those who witness, and refuse. Moving within the traditions of Tubman, of Combahee, and the unnamed, unknown people who witness, let us commit once again that it is our duty to fight for freedom. Thank you.
Dr. Lindsey, thank you very much for that very thought-provoking presentation. My name is Armando Guerrero Estrada, and I work in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and I have the honor of moderating our Q&A session for today. So just a friendly reminder to our audience that if you haven't submitted a question, please do so. Feel free to do so in the Q&A box towards the bottom of your screen. Let us go ahead and begin with one of the questions. So I love how interdisciplinary and intersectional your approach is to history. So when thinking about the stories of our becoming, how might interdisciplinary approaches contribute to the retrieval and the archival of Black experiences? And you mentioned a little bit about this, but specifically, how can hip hop, pop culture, material culture contribute to what you're saying is a more robust way of witnessing?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's such a fantastic question because one of the things that I learned as someone who's trained as a historian, but has now been teaching in women's gender and sexuality studies for the last several years, is that the interdisciplinary approach, we have to look at unconventional archives, that often archives are a reflection of power, perspective, and ideology. And I usually tell my students PIP, right? Power, ideology, and perspective. That those who have the power to control the narrative are often who is present in the archive, that ideologies shape archive, that perspectives, right? So the perspective of the victor, the perspectives of the enslaver, the perspective of those who have power often predominates the archive. So often we have to look at unconventional places and spaces to find marginalized stories because they were never voiceless. It's just who was hearing those voices and who was not, right? So you'll hear some people say, we have to speak for those who can't. It's like, people have always been speaking and resisting and engaging and pushing back against. However, who is listening? Right? It's structured through power. It's structured through marginalization. And so when you see sites like hip hop, for instance, one of the reasons I love studying hip hop, because hip hop emerges at a moment of divestment from certain communities, migration patterns that are happening, heightened racism, the war on drugs is occurring in this. There's a certain political context out of which hip hop emerges. And it is important to see how hip hop can respond to that on one hand from a political standpoint, and how creativity has always been an outlet for response. And we can look to poetry, art, writing, music, dance, material culture to see the ways that people were pushing back against the status quo and pushing for a more equitable and just world and imagining other kinds of worlds. And people are using creativity because having joy is part of resistance. You need to be sustained in these incredible struggles. These things wear you down. Racism wears people down. One of the definitions of racism that's offered by Ruthie Wilson Gilmore is the set of conditions that can lead and does often lead to premature death. It is the wearing down of communities that happen based on this construction of race. And so finding joy and abundance and smiles and moments of intimacy and love are so important. And again, have a longer history than just a current kind of framing of Black joy, right, that you hear now, or magic, that this is a longer tradition that's really important to look at when we're thinking through resistance and we're thinking through where we can look to find that kind of resistance. And you can look at these places, particularly material and creative culture, and find an incredible archive of resistance to anti-Blackness, to white supremacy, to slavery, to Jim Crow, to mass targeted incarceration. All of these have these outlets in other places, and they're not necessarily going to be at an archive at my institution or your institution. They're going to be in different places. They're going to be in the wisdom that's shared between generations. Between loved ones and intimate family histories that are important to recover in this. And so I encourage people to really think about where we're getting our information from and how we continue to look for information in more unconventional places.
Thank you very much. I think you're absolutely right. For minoritized communities, the arts have been something, that have played a role in subversiveness and resistance for a very long time. And to think of those stories that may not necessarily be written, but maybe performed or acted out or in poetry and so forth, to think of those as unconventional archives, I think is absolutely beautiful. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. I want to go to a question from our audience, and you spoke just a tad bit about this just now, about Black joy. Our question is, thank you for the multiple historical narratives framed and reframed in the support of a Black past and Black futures. How can a Black imaginary, resistance, insurgency, radical activism, reckoning, and witnessing also be about Black joy? How do you teach students through these resistances the power of witnessing and the importance of Black struggles and Black joy?
Yes. So some of my favorite moments when I'm teaching about, and I just finished writing a book, right, about violence. So it's like a super heavy book, and there's not a whole lot of joy in there because of the weight of what I'm talking about. But what I found, even when I'm recovering people like Rosa Parks, right? I talked about a reframing of her. Another reframing of Rosa Parks is understanding her legacy with yoga and the practice of centering her body. There are these incredible images of Rosa Parks and others at Highlander School, or Freedom School, and training school for organizers and activists practicing yoga, right? And then you have images of Martin Luther King and other freedom fighters playing pool. It's one of my favorite images of Martin Luther King. Or you see images of Maya Angelou and James Baldwin dancing, right? That there are so many of our freedom fighters who write and talk about joy and love and intimacy and fun, because what is a future? What is justice without the access to pleasure and joy and connection and intimacy? That is part of for me, a freedom struggle agenda, that freedom and liberation look like the ability to experience joy and to be connected to other people in ways that isn't overdetermined by power and access and relationality through the economy, right? That they're just ways of connecting. And so for me, thinking about these histories and these freedom struggles is finding those images, listening to the songs. You know, nobody every day, all day isn't like, everything I do is about the struggle, right? And demarcating the struggle in this very narrow way, right? Because part of the end goal, what we imagine into a future, is a possibility where we're not having to do this fight, right? So if we're not having to do this fight, what then replaces that? It is that energy, it is that connection, it is that ability to smile and love and care for one another. In that call that I read out from Assata Shakur, is our duty to love and protect one another, right? And that love, to me, can be and should be a joyous practice as well as an accountability practice to this fight for freedom. And, you know, that history is really important, and it's in there, that seeing it even in more contemporary marches and protests. There are people who are dancing, there are people playing music, there are people playing drums, there are people who are healers. There's a number of ways to enter the space. There are people who are cooking for other people to ensure that they're sustained and enjoying food together. And so those moments of joy and connection are integral and intractable from the broader freedom struggles that Black people, Indigenous folks, minoritized people across the world must engage. Because if you don't see joy at the end of the thing, what is the fight for? Right? What is the fight for? Beyond dismantling, what are you creating at the other side of that?
Thank you for that. I want to stay on this topic of Black bodies for just a quick second, if it's okay. And I want to see if you can maybe address particularly our young college students. So what would you say to young Black women who may feel like they are always having to put their bodies on the line during these freedom struggles of the everydayness that you speak about? What hope would you offer to these young Black women in this particular situation?
Ooh, right. Hope is a discipline, right? An incredible discipline. That is a framing from amazing organizer Miriam Kaba of Hope is a Discipline, right? I encourage my sisters to rest when you need to rest, to find spaces and communities of people who affirm your need to rest and joy and take a step back from that, because unfortunately we're still in a place where the assaults and the assailing on your body, on your life, on your livelihood is ever present, right? So part of that is deciding when and where you enter, right? To quote, thinking about Paula Giddings and quoting Black women in the 19th century and club women of deciding when and where we enter. That yes, the struggle will be there and the struggle needs us, but the struggle also needs us to be well. The struggle also needs us to be intact and to be affirmed and to rest and to have practices that allow for joy and pleasure that are not in service of other people, right? So there are all these monikers, right? The strong Black woman, dispel that. You are not required to be that. That is also, as much as it can feel like an affirmation or a compliment, often what it's doing is putting you in the position of forever laboring, right? Of forever being the kind of mules of the earth. I'm thinking about Zora Neale Hurston, the person who's there, or having to specialize in the wholly impossible, right? And so often we do that, and then people are like, Black women save America, or Black women did this, and the brief affirmation feels good, but at what cost? What's at stake? And what do we see in that wearing down and those premature deaths that we see among young Black women? I want you here. I want you here for the worlds that we're creating and building, which means taking rest, which means taking refuge and respite when necessary, and coming back to fight when you're ready and when you're equipped, and ensuring that you're building with other people. So at no one point is everybody out and everybody in, that they're movement pieces. So you're organizing together in a collective, so one individual doesn't zap out all of the energy of a particular movement or protest or campaign.
Wow, thank you so much for that wisdom. Absolutely powerful. So we have a question from one of our students here who asked if you could speak a little bit more on selective amnesia and maybe offer some books or articles that would highlight some impactful events that have been glossed over.
Great. So selective amnesia, I feel like is this moment that we're living through in many ways right now in how we grapple with an inglorious history. So how do we talk about Indigenous genocide, right? We're talking about land back movements right now. And then you'll see people like, yes, land back, or give a land acknowledgement at the beginning of the thing, but are we actually prepared to give land back? Is one way of thinking about this, or what it means to talk about COVID and its disparate impact on already marginalized and vulnerable communities without understanding longer histories of medical racism, of economic disenfranchisement and dispossession. How do we talk about those things, right? And so people want to take a very presentist approach to very real contemporary problems. And selective amnesia will have you attempting to answer them as though they are wholly new or only part of this moment and not part of a longer history. And selective amnesia also dictates the kind of curriculum that we teach, what books we're gonna ban, what stories we are gonna tell, who's going to be at the center of the narratives that we use. And so that becomes really important in a space like this to talk about that. Off tops of the books I'm thinking about, At the Dark End of the Street by Danielle McGuire is a fantastic revisioning of the civil rights movement, and really starting from this place of how sexual activism against sexual violence is actually one of the propelling forces of these movements. So it really kind of centers Black women's activism from the civil rights movement to the Black Power movement, which also kind of reperiodizes it. I'm thinking about Beyond Respectability by Brittany Cooper, which offers a really rich history of like Black women's intellectual history. And thinking about this, I'm thinking about Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, to think about the kind of longer history of the Black left and robust histories in that way. I can certainly send y'all a little bibliography after this to send out to attendees. Liberated Threads by Tanisha Ford, which is an incredible book looking at a transnational kind of history of the civil rights and Black power movements in South Africa, London, and the United States, and seeing the connections between those. And a really recent book, Wicked Flesh by Jessica Marie Johnson, which gives a recasting of how we understand slavery and the reproductive and productive labor that was demanded of Black people during slavery. So there's so many incredible works that are out there that help us to understand and grapple with the afterlives of slavery, the afterlives of Jim Crow, and the current lives of kind of mass criminalization and incarceration of minoritized people.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lindsey. And that syllabus, or that, those materials that you're speaking of, would definitely appreciate them if you could just, send them over our way. You've provided us with so many wonderful resources. So thank you for that. So at this time, I'd like to invite the Director of the Diversity and Inclusion Office, Dr. Jennifer Schoaf.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lindsey. Wow, such a powerful and empowering tribute, placing women's radical imaginary at the center of Black liberation movements is precisely what I was excited to hear from you. So thank you so much. We have had an amazing day. I thank you all for your presence here. What a day of profound and inspiring conversation. I'm going to take Dr. Lindsey's use of Shakur's call to action of the duty to love and protect one another to see if you all wouldn't mind. We're going to open the chat section, and please place a call to action, an affirmation, or some other takeaway that you had from today. We would love to close with that. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Lindsey, and all of our participants today, and our audience for just being really, really engaged. So it's been a real pleasure.